The stormy night was restless, echoing with distant thunder, but nothing compared to the storm raging inside Beauty. Alone, trembling, and in agonizing pain, she staggered through the hospital doors, desperate for help. Yet, instead of finding comfort, she met a cold, unyielding wall of indifference. Indeed, what a cold and stormy night. We're thrilled to have you join us on this journey, and your support means the world. Stay tuned, because what you're about to witness will leave you moved and inspired. It was a stormy night, and the hospital maternity ward was buzzing with activity. Nurses rushed back and forth, tending to patients, while the distant sounds of beeping machines echoed through the halls. In the middle of all this chaos, a car pulled up to the emergency entrance. The door swung open, and Beauty slowly stepped out, her face pale and drenched with sweat. She was clutching her belly, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. Beauty was a beautiful black woman, known for her calm and gentle nature. But tonight, she was struggling. Her body was aching all over, sharp pains shooting through her back, cramps tightening her pelvis, and waves of nausea making her feel dizzy. She had tried to stay at home as long as possible, just like her husband had taught her. Dr. Eric, her loving husband, had explained everything to her. He knew this was her second time giving birth, and he had prepared her well. But the pain had grown unbearable. She felt weak, dehydrated, and her legs could barely carry her. As she stumbled towards the entrance, she was supported by the family driver. Her husband was miles away, assisting in a major surgery at another hospital, and he had instructed the driver to bring her in if her labor began. Beauty tried to breathe, just as Eric had taught her. Deep breaths. You can do this, she whispered to herself. But each step felt harder than the last, and she was scared. Inside the hospital, the nurse on duty was Caitlyn. She was a tall, sharp-featured woman with tired eyes. She had been working for hours, and her patience was wearing thin. She had seen all kinds of patients tonight, and she wasn't in the mood for another. When she saw Beauty being helped inside, her lips tightened, and she sighed. Another one. Just great, she muttered under her breath. Beauty's legs wobbled as she approached the front desk. Please, I need help, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She was gasping for air, and her hands trembled as she held onto the counter for support. But Caitlyn didn't even look up. She was busy arranging some papers, her expression bored and annoyed. Name? Caitlyn asked, not bothering to make eye contact. Beauty tried to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Her body was shaking, and she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her belly. She gripped the counter tighter, trying to keep herself from falling. Can't you speak? I asked for your name, Caitlyn repeated, this time looking directly at Beauty, her eyes cold and impatient. Beauty's lips trembled as she tried to form the words, but another wave of pain hit her, and she let out a soft cry. Caitlyn rolled her eyes and sighed loudly. Great, another one who thinks she's the only one in pain, she muttered, loud enough for Beauty to hear. Look, just sit down and wait. I'll call someone when I'm ready. Beauty felt a sting of humiliation. She had tried to stay calm, to manage her pain quietly, but Caitlyn's harsh words made her feel small and powerless. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She needed to focus on her baby. She took a deep breath and tried to walk towards the waiting area, but her legs felt like they were about to give out. The driver hurried to support her, but Beauty could barely keep her eyes open. She was dizzy, and her head was spinning. Please, help me, she whispered again, but Caitlyn didn't move. She just continued shuffling her papers, as if Beauty was invisible. Finally, Caitlyn looked up and saw that Beauty was still standing there, struggling to stay upright. She huffed in frustration and picked up a wheelchair. Fine. Sit down, but don't think you're getting any special treatment, she said, pushing the wheelchair towards Beauty with a rough shove. Beauty slowly sank into the chair, her body aching all over. She didn't have the strength to argue or explain. She just wanted to see her husband, to feel his hand in hers, and to know that everything would be okay. But as she sat there, alone and scared, she felt a tear slide down her cheek. Caitlyn pushed the wheelchair towards a small room and left Beauty there, all alone. "Wait here," she said, her tone sharp and uncaring. "I'll be back, eventually." As Caitlyn walked away, Beauty curled up in the chair, clutching her belly as another wave of pain surged through her. The room felt cold and empty, and for a moment, she wondered if she was truly alone in this struggle. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Eric, please come soon." But she had no idea how much more she would have to endure before she saw him again. Beauty's pain grew stronger, stabbing through her body like a knife. Her hands trembled as she clutched the armrest of the wheelchair, trying to keep herself from crying out. She could barely breathe, and her lips were dry and cracked. Every time she tried to speak, the words got stuck in her throat. She needed help, but no one seemed to care. Caitlyn finally wheeled Beauty into a small, cramped room. She parked the wheelchair by the bed and stood there, arms crossed, looking down at Beauty with a bored expression. "Well, are you going to get up, or do you need me to lift you?" she said, her tone sharp. Beauty tried to move, but her body was weak, and her legs felt like jelly. She shifted slightly, trying to push herself up, but the pain made her wince. Caitlyn rolled her eyes. "I don't have all night," she snapped. "If you can't stand, then just say so. Stop wasting my time." Beauty's cheeks burned with humiliation. She had never felt so small, so helpless. She tried to explain that her back was hurting and she couldn't move easily, but Caitlyn wasn't listening. "I've seen plenty of women in labor," Caitlyn continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And they all think they're in the worst pain ever. But guess what? You're not the only one having a baby tonight, so stop acting like it." Beauty's eyes filled with tears. She was trying so hard to stay calm, to breathe through the contractions like her husband had taught her. But Caitlyn's words were like knives, cutting deeper than the pain in her body. She felt trapped, like no matter what she did, it wouldn't be enough to make anyone care. Just then, another nurse peeked into the room. It was Olivia, a junior nurse who was new to the hospital. She had heard Beauty's soft cries from down the hall, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Olivia was young and kind-hearted, but she was also nervous around Caitlyn, who had a reputation for being strict and harsh. "Is everything okay in here?" Olivia asked, her voice gentle. She saw the tears on Beauty's cheeks and the way she was struggling to breathe, and her heart ached. She stepped closer, wanting to help, but Caitlyn shot her a sharp look. "She's fine," Caitlyn said, her tone firm. "Just a little dramatic, that's all." Olivia hesitated, glancing back at Beauty. "Maybe we should give her some water. She looks dehydrated," she suggested quietly. Caitlyn scoffed, shaking her head. "Water, please. She's not dying. She's having a baby. She can wait." Caitlyn's coldness made Olivia flinch, but she didn't dare argue. Instead, she gave Beauty a sympathetic smile before stepping back, wishing she could do more. Beauty tried to speak, but another wave of pain crashed over her, making her gasp. She wanted to tell Olivia that she was scared, that she felt something was wrong, but the words wouldn't come out. She reached out, her hand shaking, hoping someone would take it and comfort her. But Caitlyn just turned away, busying herself with a clipboard, ignoring Beauty completely. As the pain grew stronger, Beauty's mind drifted to thoughts of her husband. She could picture his warm, comforting smile and the way he always made her feel safe. "Eric," she whispered, barely audible. "I need you." Caitlyn heard her and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Oh, now she wants her husband," she said, rolling her eyes. "Well, honey, he's not here, so you're just going to have to deal with this on your own. Maybe next time, don't wait until you're practically falling apart before coming to the hospital." The words stung, and Beauty's heart sank. She had tried to be strong, tried to handle the contractions at home as long as she could. But now she was here, and all she wanted was some kindness, some comfort. Instead, she felt like she was being punished for needing help. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she watched Caitlyn humiliate Beauty. She wanted to stand up to her, to say something, but she was too scared. She knew Caitlyn had more experience, and she didn't want to make things worse. So she just stood there, feeling powerless, as Beauty's suffering continued. Beauty's breaths came out in short, desperate gasps. She clutched her belly, trying to hold on as the pain twisted through her body. She was exhausted, and every part of her felt like it was on fire. She couldn't remember ever feeling so alone, even though she was surrounded by people. Caitlyn glanced at the clock and sighed, as if Beauty's pain was an inconvenience. "I'm going to check on my other patients," she said, her voice casual. "You stay here and try not to make too much noise. I'll be back when I can." With that, Caitlyn left the room, leaving Beauty alone in the cold, empty space. Olivia lingered for a moment, her heart breaking for Beauty. I'll see if I can find some water," she whispered, before hurrying out, not daring to look at Caitlyn as she passed. As Beauty sat there, curled up in the wheelchair, she felt a tear roll down her cheek. She was scared, in pain, and so very tired. She closed her eyes and whispered one last time, "Eric, please, come soon." But all she could hear was the echo of Caitlyn's harsh laughter, and it made her feel more alone than ever. Beauty's contractions were coming faster, each one more painful than the last. She felt like her whole body was being squeezed and twisted, and she struggled to catch her breath. She was drenched in sweat, her hands gripping the edges of the wheelchair. Caitlyn sighed dramatically, as if Beauty's request was the most difficult thing she had heard all night. Fine, she said, rolling her eyes. "I'll get you some water, but then you need to stop this. You're not the only patient here, you know." Just as Caitlyn was about to turn and leave, the door to the room swung open with a loud creak. Standing in the doorway was Olivia, her face pale but determined. "She needs help, and she needs it now," Olivia said, her voice louder than usual. "I heard her talking to her husband. He's on his way, and he's not going to be happy if he finds out she's been left like this." Caitlyn stared at Olivia, taken aback by her sudden courage. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "Who do you think you are, telling me how to do my job?" But Olivia didn't back down. "Her husband is Dr. Eric," she said, her voice firm. "And if he finds out how you've been treating her, there will be consequences." Caitlyn's expression changed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Dr. Eric," she repeated, her voice quieter now. She had no idea who Beauty's husband was, and suddenly, the situation felt a lot more serious. Beauty's eyes widened, and she felt a spark of hope. "Eric, he's coming," she whispered, clutching her belly as another wave of pain washed over her. But she had no idea what was about to happen, or how much everything would change when he arrived. Caitlyn's face went pale as she processed Olivia's words. "Dr. Eric," she muttered, trying to keep her composure. She had heard the name many times before. Dr. Eric was one of the most respected doctors at the hospital, calm, skilled, and dedicated. But she had never imagined that the exhausted, desperate woman in front of her could be his wife. Suddenly, everything felt different. Caitlyn's smug smile disappeared, replaced by a flicker of nervousness. She glanced at Beauty, who was now slumped in the wheelchair, gasping for air. Caitlyn swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. She needed to stay in control, but there was a knot forming in her stomach. "Look, I didn't know who your husband was," Caitlyn said, her voice faltering. She tried to sound sympathetic, but her words were still sharp. "If I had known, I would have." Before she could finish, the door swung open once again, and this time, it wasn't Olivia. Dr. Eric walked in, his expression calm but intense. He had just finished the surgery, his scrubs still on, and his eyes scanned the room until they landed on Beauty. For a moment, everything else disappeared. He rushed to her side, kneeling down, and took her hand gently. "Beauty, I'm here," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "I'm so sorry I took so long." He could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion in her body, and it made his heart ache. He knew she had been trying to stay strong, but he could also see how much she was struggling. Beauty's lips trembled as she looked at him. "Eric, it hurts. I can't," she whispered, barely able to speak. Her relief at seeing him was overwhelming, and for the first time that night, she felt a sense of safety. Eric's gaze turned to Caitlyn, and his eyes hardened. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge that made Caitlyn's stomach twist. "Why is my wife in this condition, and why hasn't anyone been helping her?" Caitlyn stammered, trying to come up with an explanation. I didn't know she was your wife," she said, forcing a nervous smile. "I thought she was just another patient, and we've been really busy tonight. I was going to get her some water, and—" Eric didn't let her finish. "I don't care if you knew she was my wife or not," he said, his voice cold and precise. "Every patient deserves care, especially when they are in labor and in pain. What I see here is a woman who has been ignored, humiliated, and left to suffer. That is unacceptable." Caitlyn's face flushed with embarrassment. She had never been spoken to like this, especially not by a doctor as respected as Eric. She opened her mouth to argue, but Eric's sharp gaze stopped her. There was no room for excuses, and she knew it. Olivia stepped forward, her heart pounding but relieved that someone was finally standing up for Beauty. "Dr. Eric, I tried to help," she said quietly. "But Caitlyn, she wouldn't listen. She said Beauty was overreacting, and she wouldn't let me give her any water. I'm so sorry." Eric's eyes softened as he looked at Olivia. "Thank you for telling me the truth," he said, "and thank you for trying to help her. That's what you're supposed to do." He turned back to Caitlyn, his expression stern. "You, on the other hand, have failed her tonight. Not just as a nurse, but as a person. You were cruel when she needed compassion." Caitlyn's mouth opened and closed as she tried to think of something to say, but she was at a loss. She had been so focused on keeping control, on brushing off Beauty's pain, that she hadn't thought about the consequences. Now those consequences were staring her right in the face. Eric gently helped Beauty out of the wheelchair, guiding her to lie down on the bed. He checked her pulse, felt her forehead, and whispered soothingly, "I'm here, Beauty. You're safe now. We're going to get through this together." Beauty's tears flowed freely, but they were tears of relief. She had been so scared, so alone, but now Eric was here, and he was taking care of her, just like he always did. She gripped his hand tightly, feeling his strength and his love. "Olivia, please stay with her," Eric instructed. "I'll need you to assist, and make sure she's hydrated." Olivia nodded, rushing to get water and a cool cloth for Beauty. She was glad to finally be doing something helpful, something that might ease Beauty's suffering. Eric then looked back at Caitlyn, his face calm but unyielding. "You are off this case," he said. "I will report this to the hospital administration, and there will be an investigation. If you think it's acceptable to treat any patient the way you treated my wife, then you have no place here." Caitlyn's heart pounded, her face pale. She had been expecting a reprimand, but not this. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that she might lose her job over this. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say that would change what she had done. As Eric turned back to Beauty, his expression softened. He stroked her hair gently, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Beauty. I should have been here sooner." Beauty managed a small smile, even through the pain. "You're here now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all that matters." The room was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of Eric's soothing words and the gentle touch of Olivia as she cared for Beauty. Caitlyn stood frozen by the door, the weight of her actions heavy on her shoulders. She had never felt more ashamed, more exposed. As she slowly stepped back out of the room, she knew she had a lot to think about. But for now, all she could feel was regret. The next morning, The events of the previous night had spread through the hospital like wildfire. Every staff member seemed to have heard about how Nurse Caitlyn had mistreated Dr. Eric's wife, Beauty, during labor. Whispers echoed in the hallways, and even the senior administrators had taken notice. Caitlyn arrived at her shift, trying to maintain her usual confident demeanor, but she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. She knew they were talking about her, and it made her stomach churn. She thought about what had happened the night before, how Eric had looked at her, the sharp disappointment in his eyes. She had always prided herself on being tough and efficient, but now she was beginning to wonder if she had crossed a line she could never step back from. As she walked past the nurse's station, Caitlyn noticed Olivia talking to another nurse. They both stopped and looked at her, but Olivia didn't smile. Caitlyn wanted to explain herself, to say that she was tired, that it had been a long night, that she hadn't meant to be cruel. But deep down, she knew those were just excuses. Olivia had been tired too, yet she had still tried to help Beauty. "Caitlyn, could you come with me, please?" The voice startled her, and she turned to see one of the senior administrators standing there. His expression was serious, and Caitlyn felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. Without a word, she followed him down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked into a small office where Dr. Eric was already seated, along with another hospital administrator. Caitlyn hesitated for a moment before sitting down, avoiding Eric's gaze. She could still see the stern, disappointed look on his face from the night before. The administrator began to speak, his tone firm but professional. "Caitlyn, we've reviewed the incident from last night, and we've heard from several witnesses, including Dr. Eric and Nurse Olivia. It's clear that your conduct was not only unprofessional, but it lacked the compassion and empathy that we expect from our staff, especially when dealing with patients in pain." Caitlyn's face flushed with shame. She wanted to protest, to say that she hadn't realized Beauty was in so much distress, but she knew that wouldn't change anything. She lowered her eyes, waiting for the decision. As a result, the administrator continued, "You are being placed on a 1-week suspension, effective immediately. During this time, you will also be enrolled in a 1-month compulsory training program on compassionate care. We believe it's important for you to understand the significance of empathy and respect in your interactions with patients, regardless of their situation." Caitlyn's heart sank. Suspension and compulsory training. She had never been reprimanded like this before. The words stung, but what hurt more was knowing that she had truly failed. She wanted to argue, to say she didn't need the training, but she could still feel the weight of her actions from the night before. She could still see the look on Beauty's face, the fear, the pain, and the exhaustion that she had ignored. Eric finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Caitlyn, I understand that you've had long shifts, and I know how tiring this job can be. But that's no excuse for the way you treated my wife, or any patient, for that matter. Compassion isn't just a part of the job, it's the most important part. You didn't know Beauty was my wife, and that's exactly the point. Every patient deserves the same care and kindness, no matter who they are." Caitlyn swallowed, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt her." Eric's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I hope you take this as a chance to learn, Caitlyn. The training is not a punishment. It's an opportunity to grow and become better at what you do. I know you can be a good nurse, but it starts with understanding that people are more than just patients. They are human beings, and they deserve to be treated with dignity." The administrator nodded in agreement. "Your suspension will start immediately, and we expect you to complete the training program before you return to regular duties. We'll also be monitoring your performance closely after that. We want to see improvement, Caitlyn, not just in your skills, but in how you engage with patients." Caitlyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had never thought of herself as a bad person, but now she was beginning to see just how much her attitude had affected others. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I'll do better." The meeting ended, and Caitlyn walked out of the office feeling a mix of emotions: embarrassment, guilt, but also a strange sense of relief. She knew she had to change, and maybe this was her chance to start over. As she left the hospital, she glanced down the hall, where she saw Eric and Beauty in a room, holding their newborn baby. Beauty looked tired but happy, a soft smile on her face as she cradled the infant in her arms. Caitlyn paused, watching them for a moment. She had been so wrong, and now she had to live with the consequences. But seeing the love and peace in that room, she realized something important. She needed to find a way to bring more of that kind of warmth and care into her work, not just because she was told to, but because it was the right thing to do. As she walked out of the hospital, she made a silent promise to herself. The next time she walked through those doors, she would be a different person, a better nurse, one who truly understood what it meant to care. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you were touched by this story. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your feedback and support mean everything to us. And with your help, we'll continue to bring you more beautiful, heartwarming tales.